Okay, so we are now getting really into the history of the contact between the African continent and the Europeans, and we're expanding that to include the contact between Europe, Africa, and the quote-unquote New World of North and South America. So this unit is concerned specifically with the Atlantic slave trade, and we're talking about its development from the 16th, so remember that's the 1500s, although we're going to go back a little further than that, all the way to the 18th century, which again, that means the 1700s. Okay, so talking about slavery in Africa before the Atlantic trade began. Slavery in general has a long history in Africa and Europe and in Asia. It's a sad fact that it seems to exist pretty well wherever humanity is. We see evidence of some kind of slavery. So going all the way back into the time period of ancient Egypt, we know that the ancient Egyptians transported slaves from Nubia. They also transported some slaves across the Sahara Desert to North Africa in Roman times. Others were sent to labor in the states of the Persian Gulf and in India, but these numbers were very small when we compare to the later Atlantic slave trade and just the vast draining of humanity out of specific parts of Africa. Slave labor was also used in the mid-Saharan salt mines from ancient times. So again, slavery's been around, and I want to emphasize that this is not, again, limited to Africa. There was slavery that existed in Europe. The Romans definitely used it. Different ancient societies used it. It existed in Asia. So we're specifically focused on the history of slavery in Africa, not to point it out as some sort of blame or anything. We're just talking about it because we're talking about how it developed into the Atlantic slave trade. So here we go. The scale of it increased dramatically with the expansion of the trans-Saharan trade and the Muslim expansion into North Africa. It's no surprise that with the expansion of trade, there is an expansion of a need for slave labor because they want to maximize their profits. They want to mine the salts, they want to mine gold and whatever other goods that are being transported across in the trans-Saharan trade, and by doing that, they don't want to pay the workers any kind of money, and so hence the use of slavery. Now, Islamic law does not allow for the enslavement of fellow Muslims, and so because of that, these North African Muslim merchants had to seek slaves from non-Muslim societies, specifically those south of the Sahara. And so because of that, the transportation of captives for sale into slavery in North Africa became a really regular part of the trans-Saharan trade. And we've mentioned that before. We mentioned about the sale of captives in the trans-Saharan trade, and also the fact that it was very common amongst, it was the most prosperous export of the Ethiopians as well. So again, we're just reiterating the history of slavery specifically in Africa. But the important distinction is that slavery in the Muslim world was not the plantation slavery of the Americas. So the type of slavery is very different. And to make any kind of generalization about what it meant to be a slave is extremely difficult. What the life of a slave was like is extremely dependent on the where and the when. The experience could extend from the very harsh, unbelievably harsh experience of a slave in North and South America working on plantations to the relatively easy and valued position of a Greek slave in ancient Rome who was maybe tutoring a wealthy Roman family's children. And again, they were valued. But we can't say that they had an easy existence because they're still a slave. They still don't have their freedom. But again, just the variation of what it meant to be a slave is dependent on place and time. So we can't really make any kind of broad generalization about the life of a slave, quote unquote. So again, slavery in the Muslim world is not the plantation slavery of the Americas. And again, it's dependent on place and time. Male slaves were often incorporated into armies. And once in the army, a former slave could rise to high office. Being a former slave didn't necessarily hold you back from any kind of economic, political, or social advancement. Female slaves in particular were in high demand, unfortunately, as household servants and very sadly often as concubines. And this existed across the Muslim world of North Africa and Western Asia as well. And you can see that the map that I put over here to the right, the black lines indicate specifically slave trade routes at the time period in question throughout the Muslim world. So you can see not only going out of West Africa into Northern Africa, but also on the eastern coast, going out into the Persian Gulf and beyond. There was always some form of slavery or subservient labor as a part of African society south of Sahara. The slaves would usually originate as war captives in larger and more centralized states. I mean, think about ancient Ghana, Mali, etc. They were usually thoroughly incorporated into the economy and society, and could eventually become a part of the society of these larger states. In smaller, more decentralized communities, they would probably be more likely to be treated as outsiders. And sometimes they were ransomed back to their origins. So the point of this being, it wasn't necessarily a permanent state if you were a slave, an African slave, being captured in war and being taken to another African society prior to the transatlantic slave trade. Slaves were sometimes sold in markets, but this was not a regular feature prior to European involvement in the slave trade. And they weren't usually captured with the intent to sell. So that's another important distinction between slavery that existed in Africa prior to European involvement and after European involvement, when you're going to see these slave markets, large-scale slave markets, and again, slaves being captured with the intent of them being sold. And increasingly on from the 11th century, as states on the southern fringes of the Sahara converted to Islam, their armies would raid into non-Muslim communities to obtain more captives for slaves. And this continued on to the end of the 19th century at the very latest. But again, this is largely a small-scale operation. This is not on the level that we're going to see later on with the transatlantic slave trade. Okay, so let's get into that time period. It's going to start with the Portuguese, because the Portuguese, of course, as we've already mentioned, were the first Europeans to really start exploring the coast of Africa. So going back to the time of those initial voyages, we're talking about the late 1400s. So these initial voyages of the Portuguese onto the West African coast were focused on bypassing the Muslims of North Africa and gaining access to the gold-producing regions of West Africa. So if you look at the map over here to the right, and you look at where Portugal is, if you don't know where it is, it shares a peninsula with Spain. And instead of going across the Mediterranean through North Africa and to the West Coast, which they don't want to do because they don't want to use the Muslims of North Africa as middlemen, they're starting to go around on the coast. And so, again, the region is to access the gold and also to provide Portugal with a major source of national wealth, i.e. gold. That's pretty self-explanatory, but there you go. So with that in mind, they're going to finance some further exploration across the southern tip of Africa and on into India. And again, hoping to bypass the Muslim-controlled trading routes of West Asia. And we talked about that, the back and forth between the various European powers in the Mediterranean and the Muslims on the northern coast. The Muslims are pretty much always controlling that trading route through the Mediterranean into Western Asia, and so they're looking to bypass that by going all the way around Africa. So Portuguese sailing ships are going to first reach the West African coast in the late 1400s, specifically the 1470s. They're going to establish a Fort Elmina, to protect this passage from any kind of rival European shipping on the coast. And there is a picture of it down there on the right-hand corner. They traded copper, brass, and European cloth in exchange for gold with the indigenous population. And they offered goods that were previously obtained from Songhai and the trans-Saharan trade. So in the course of their exploration of the western coast of Africa and beyond, in the 1480s, the Portuguese discovered these two uninhabited islands, the islands of Principe and Sao Tome. And on these islands, which you can see where they are, I put two maps, so a closer view is over there on the right of the two islands you can see off the coast there. And where they are in regards to the whole of Africa, you can see over there to the left off the west coast of Africa. So again, they are uninhabited, meaning nobody's living there. So they decide to seize the opportunity to develop some sugar plantations, the weather being ideal, the climate for growing sugar. To grow sugar, you need a very particular climate, otherwise it won't grow. So much so that if you look at a place like Louisiana in America, it'll grow in the very southern portions of the state of Louisiana, but not in the northern portion. So again, you need a pretty specific climate to get it to grow properly, and these islands had it. And so they established these large-scale sugar plantations that are manned with slave labor from the African mainland, because again, nobody's living on these islands. So the Portuguese presence along the coast of tropical West Africa gives them the need for captives to be bought from local chiefdoms for the sale into slavery. So again, this is different now. Slavery did exist in Africa before, but they really weren't in general caught with the purpose of being sold for a profit. Now that's starting to change, because now the Europeans have a demand, they have a need. They're going to start establishing plantations in on these islands in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, and then eventually in the New World. So there's this need. Captives are now going to be sold into slavery. Initially, so we're talking 15th to 16th century, they mostly come from the Senegal and Gambia regions, and they're transported to farms and plantations in southern Spain and Portugal. And those from the Niger Delta and the Congo are mostly going to Sao Tome. So not getting into the New World just as yet. We're going to get to that in a second here. So again, getting into that, Columbus's pioneering 1492 discovery, quote unquote, of the New World by the Europeans led the Spanish to quickly colonize and exploit the New World, followed by other European countries later on. And so they want to get in on the game. Again, the Portuguese, they have their plantations in the Mediterranean and off the coast of Africa. They're making a lot of money. Now the Spanish are going to get into it. And again, eventually other European countries, notably the British, which would eventually become America. So what do they need? They need a large imported labor force for the gold and silver mines on the mainland of South America and the tobacco plantations on the Caribbean islands. And if you look at the map over there on the right, it's going to tell you eventually all the different kinds of cash crops that were grown and where they grew them. So tobacco, largely on the Caribbean islands and in North America, coffee in Central and South America, cotton in North America, sugar in the Caribbean islands, mining really in South America, and rice mainly in North America and the Caribbean islands. So why did they turn more towards Africa versus other sources of slaves? Well, they did have other sources of slaves initially. Initially, they're going to use the indigenous population, but a vast majority of them are going to succumb to the harsh treatment that comes with being a slave and disease. So we know quite a bit about disease, and unfortunately, a lot of us are experiencing the transmission of deadly diseases firsthand. But if you don't have any exposure to a disease, hence the term novel coronavirus that we're hearing day in and day out now, we've never had this exposure to this strain before, so none of us has immunity. Now think about the scale of that when you have an entire continent that has never been, an entire two continents that have never been in contact with any other part of the world since, for centuries. So there's no exposure that they have to the diseases brought by the Europeans because they've had no contact. And so the Europeans also have had more exposure to diseases because they've had more livestock. Like the coronavirus, a lot of diseases originate in livestock, and then the virus mutates and it gets passed on to human populations. And for various reasons, there really wasn't a large-scale agriculture involving livestock in North and South America. And if you want to go into more of the history of that, I've recommended this book before, but it's just an excellent read. Guns, Germs, and Steel talks about why that is. But anyway, again, because they have no exposure to these diseases, they have no immunity, and all these different diseases, specifically smallpox, which is just a horrible, horrible disease, just wiped them out. So by the end of the first century of European contact, 90% or more of the different native groups in the Caribbean islands are completely wiped out. Just a huge loss of life. So obviously for the Europeans, that's not going to work, because they need a relatively stable workforce. There were slaves from Europe. Criminals and other various kinds of outcasts from Europe were often sent as slave labor, but they were in pretty limited numbers and also didn't have a lot of exposure on the other end to tropical diseases, and so they died out as well. So in the search for the quote-unquote ideal slave, these two groups are not working. And so they turn more and more towards Africans, which again are already being used in places like Sao Tome and other Mediterranean islands. Africans have developed a certain level of immunity to some tropical and European diseases. There's been trade between Africa and Europe since ancient times. Also, they have the experience and skills necessary for metalworking, mining, and tropical agriculture, because they've experienced all that in Africa. And there was always somewhere along the West African coast where African rulers were prepared to sell war captives and criminals for a profit. And again, the Europeans are willing to pay good money for slaves so that they can further their own profits. The first slaves are going to be transported across the Atlantic in 1532. And from that point on, there's going to be a small but steady growth in the first 100 years, and then it's just going to skyrocket after that. So again, first 100 years, you see this slow and steady growth, but eventually in the 1630s, other European countries are going to be involved in the transatlantic slave trade as well, the Dutch, the French, and the English specifically. There's going to be a rapid expansion of the sugar plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean. And so the demand for slave labor is going to increase to just enormous proportions. So over the next 200 years, the largest scale forced transportation of captive people ever devised in human history is going to take place. So again, did slavery exist prior to this point? Yes. But on this scale, no. This is something that is unprecedented, this transatlantic slave trade. So to give you some ideas, recorded statistics show that at least 10 million Africans were landed alive and sold into slavery in America and the Caribbean over the course of 300 years. A further 2 million died in transit, hence the note that they were landed alive. And that means that there was a total of at least 12 million people taken captive out of Africa. Probably more that went unrecorded, but again, at the very minimum, 12 million is the number. Originally, only a few thousand per year were sent out in the 16th century when it started, about 20,000 in the 17th century, and between 50,000 and 100,000 in the 18th century. The numbers do start to trail off in the 19th century because different countries in North and South America start banning either the slave trade or slavery or both. In America, the slave trade, the importation of new slaves, was banned in the early 1800s, and then, of course, officially with the 13th Amendment. And slavery didn't end in South America until the 1880s, but traffic, again, some traffic probably went unrecorded, and there was probably some slave trade going on illegally after these countries tried to ban it, just due to people's greed and need for more money. So going back to Africa, how did this affect African civilizations particularly? Well, the numbers of how many people were leaving via the transatlantic slave trade vary depending on the region you're talking about and also the time period you're talking about. So sometimes they might get a majority of their slaves from one part of Africa, and then it might switch, and then it might go back. Again, it just depends on the specific time period you're talking about. So for instance, Senegal in the 16th century was a very important early source of slaves. The Angolan coastline is unusual in that it remained a major slave exporting region for pretty much the entire time we're talking about, and that's the 16th to the 19th century or thereabout. The Dutch, the French, the English, and the Danes become more actively involved in the slave coast of Western modern Nigeria. They became a major source of slave later on. And with the rapid expansion of slave exports in the 18th century, pretty much every part of the Atlantic coastline from Senegal to South Angola became involved. So again, where the slaves came from specifically is dependent on time and place. However, the greatest concentration of European trading forts was along the Gold Coast of the modern state of Ghana. So where these slaves, again, where they came from depended, but where they were probably sold is probably going to be along this Gold Coast of Africa. And you can see the map over there to the left. So again, depends on where they were coming from, but they would usually be taken to this region to be traded. The Europeans themselves, the European slave traders, were not active in the business of actually capturing the victims. They didn't have the military power, and they didn't need to because they could be bought easily and cheaply along the coast. So the European activity was restricted to the trading forts along the coast, which they built with permission of local African rulers to whom they paid tribute. And the slaves would actually be captured and then sold to them from various parts of Africa. So the African rulers themselves, in general, would provide the captives, and they, along with specialist African and Afro-European slave dealers, would convey them to the coast for sale to the Europeans. The main source of people for sale for slavery were those captured in warfare. So that's going to be similar to slavery in Africa prior to the transatlantic slave trade. So again, slavery in Africa and the sales of slave predated European arrival, but the major difference here with the European-initiated slave trade was that the war captives were totally removed from Africa and sent to a place where they had a very short life expectancy with harsh conditions and, again, no hope of return. The probability that you as a slave in North and South America or the Caribbean is going to somehow escape your slavery and, make a go of it, make your own life is very, very small. So it used to be assumed that wars were waged deliberately for the purpose of gaining slaves to sell to the Europeans. And this did happen on occasion, especially in the 18th century when the demand and the prices for slaves rose precipitously. But it seems now with more recent research that more local African initiative was involved than previously assumed. And careful regional studies of this area shows the supply of captives at the coast was usually the result of specific local wars waged in the interior and not necessarily for the purpose of capturing new slaves. The prime reason for these wars was the formation and expansion of states, not for the purpose of getting slaves to sell to the Europeans. That was just a secondary benefit of fighting these wars. So it wasn't just a free-for-all where all the losers were sold into slavery either. So powerful African rulers would provide captives to the Europeans when it suited them, and some became very rich in the process. They rarely sold slaves from their own society except for unwanted criminals and outcasts, similar to the process of indentured servitude in Europe. Small societies, weak states, or the quote-unquote stateless village communities are going to be the ones that suffered greatly because it was easy to take captives from these kinds of communities. Some completely disappeared altogether into the vast machine that was the transatlantic slave trade. So again, wars in the interior were not waged just to produce slaves for exchange. But the presence of Europeans on the coast offering high prices for captives did stimulate warfare. It just wasn't the main cause of warfare. This is especially true in the 19th century when the Europeans start offering guns as the major trading item in exchange for slaves. Because, of course, having access to guns and gunpowder is going to be a major boon to these different societies. So what is the impact of the slave trade on Africa itself? Well, it increased the level of warfare in the African interior. Again, it's not the only reason for these wars being fought, but it certainly is an added cause. There's a serious loss of the productive potential of the region because the captives are no longer working for the victors. They're being completely sold out of Africa, and they're sold for a fraction of what they themselves might produce in a lifetime had they stayed in Africa. Those sold were the young because they're more likely to reach a high price on the slave market. So we're talking about people from about the ages of 14 to 35. And in the book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, published in 1972, the argument is made that Africa's chronic poverty and underdevelopment is a direct result of the European action in the transatlantic slave trade, plus then later colonialism. But our class doesn't get into colonialism, so that's a matter for another class to look at. So it can't be understated that the greatest evil of the transatlantic slave trade is not the economic hardship brought to Africa, though that's certainly terrible in and of itself, but the human suffering involved in the people, the huge numbers of 12 million people sold into slavery. The callous disregard for human life and the dignity of these people by those who dealt in the slaves is just, again, there's no words to describe it. There really isn't. A person being captured in the interior of Africa and sent to the coast for sale started a short life of appalling degradation and human suffering. And from that point on, the captives were no longer treated as humans, but specifically as property. And if you look, the picture I posted here on the right, the diagram shown of a ship transporting slaves, it's probably one of the most famous images of the slave trade at this time. And you can just see the people, the transport and the utter inhumanity of human beings. And again, the fact that they're not even viewed as humans anymore, but just property, just something to be sold for a profit and to be worked until they die. Again, there's no words. There's no words that could possibly capture just how terrible it is. Captives would have been chained together when they were captured in the interior and marched to the coast for sale. Once on the coast, they would be locked in wooden cages to await the next European ship, again, as though they were animals and not human beings. I wouldn't think that we would even want to treat animals that way nowadays, but yet we treated humans this way at one point in time. They would be stripped naked on the slave market to determine their health and fitness. And once a deal was struck with African middlemen and the European slave merchant, they would be chained once again and loaded on board on ships and these shelving units, which would be like a horrible bunk bed, I guess is the best way to describe it, in which you were not able to sit up or move to help maximize the space in the ship. And because you couldn't sit up or move, you had to live for weeks on end in excrement, and you can just imagine what that would have been like. And it's not surprising that 15 to 30% died on an average voyage across the Atlantic because of it. So depending on where you were sent, if you were a slave sold into slavery, you would be growing either sugar or coffee on plantations in Brazil, sugar specifically in the Caribbean, tobacco and cotton in the southern part of North America. And over time, the numbers and the sizes of the plantations are going to grow and expand, specifically in the 17th to 18th century, as there's a growing demand for these items. So for the European merchants, the export of slaves was only one part of a wider trading system that brought in an enormous amount of money at this time, and it's famously referred to as the triangular trade. You've probably heard that term before. So the steps of the triangular trade are that manufactured goods would be sent from Europe to Africa, and you can reference the map over there to the left to get a visual. This was especially true of guns. Guns were the number one traded item in exchange for slaves in Africa. Two, then, these items would be traded for slaves in Africa to be transported across the Atlantic. And they would be sold at 2 to 3 times the cost on the African coast. The slaves would then, in North and South America, harvest the raw materials that would be sent to Europe to manufacture the finished products to be sold to Africa in exchange for slaves, and the whole thing goes over and over and over again. So finally, we'll talk about slavery and the origins of racism. It has been argued that the roots of racism can be found in the exploitation of the people of Africa through trade. But the deep roots of it are probably more complex than this. Enslavement certainly plays a part, but again, it's probably more than that. I think it would be too simplistic to say it's just because of slavery. For almost 300 years, Africans were viewed by Europeans almost exclusively as slaves, as though slavery were some sort of a natural state for the African people. And so they, like a lot of people who are doing things that are morally reprehensible, try to argue that it's in some way okay, that they're rescuing them from a primitive and barbaric existence. And this is the first step. From this, they're going to go from where we're rescuing them and taking them to a better life to arguing for their natural inferiority. And the natural inferiority is going to become the argument for colonization, which again is the next step after slavery. But again, we go up to colonization. We don't actually talk about it. So we'll end this chapter here. Talking about the slave trade, it's going to pop up in our few remaining chapters. We don't have a lot of units left. We're on unit 12, and we only go up to 15, so we're almost to the end here. And again, this is going to be an ongoing topic all the way through the end of our class.